Welcome. We're so glad you could join us. Happy Tuesday morning. I'm going to pass it on to Layla. Layla Khalidi, she's our Director of Capacity Building at Houston in Action, to get us started.
Let me unmute myself. Good morning, everybody. Actually, Juan, do you want to go through a little bit about HIA?
Yes. So HIA brings all of you all together, other organizations that are involved in working with communities of color and low-income communities. And we envision a Harris County where every person has the opportunity to play a powerful role in shaping a just and vibrant community. And voting is a crucial part of that. So we support the growth of organizing culture. And like I said, we center Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, women, youth, low-income communities, and communities who have historically had less access to decision-making and less access to formal education. So we're a hub for coordination, for exploration, for strategy, where we reimagine the systems that impact civic participation for residents of the Houston region. You can go to the next slide, Layla. So whenever we come together, we like to remind ourselves of our working principles. So if I can get a volunteer to read out just the bolded phrases in our working principles.
I'll read them.
Great.
Freedom from discrimination, inclusive decision-making. Everyone has a voice, accessibility, engagement with community, group goals over our own interests, equity and systems level change, conflict resolution.
Thanks, Tanner. And then for our community agreements, so how we strive to interact with each other and work with each other. I can get a volunteer to read those out for us.
I can read them.
Great.
Don't make assumptions, value progress over politeness, but be polite. Think about the issue, not the person. No personal attacks. Understand others' perspective and how their community is impacted. Everyone needs a chance to speak. Maintain a long-term focus.
Thank you, Diana. So for folks who are just joining us, I want to ask you to put in your name, your pronouns, if you feel comfortable sharing them, and your organization. So that way we can put a name to the face. Welcome. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Layla to go over our agenda for the next hour and a half or so.
Thanks, Juan. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see y'all here. Again, I'm Layla Khalili. I'm Director of Capacity Building at Houston in Action. This is our training agenda for today. So we just did some intros. We're going to go into voter registration best practices. We're going to have some time to practice together in pairs, which is really important. And then we're going to debrief together. Then we'll go into tracking voter registration efforts and best practices and recommendations that we have for that. And then we'll have a Q&A portion where you can ask questions. We can clarify anything that we talked about today. And then we'll go into some next steps. And at the very end, for those of you who were in the SB1 training we did earlier this month, at the end, we ask anyone who can stay for just a couple of minutes to share any stories around voting and the elections right now with our communications team. So Allie will be on to talk with you then at the very end of our session. So we're really excited to get started and dig in with y'all. So I'm just going to introduce our facilitators today. So I introduced myself already. You know Juan, who's our Director of Public Policy at HIA. And then we have the fabulous Michael Marr with Texas Toolbelt, who is their data and analytics manager, but also has this amazing background in adult learning and training, and is just a fabulous trainer. So we're super excited to have him here to share his knowledge and expertise with us today. So again, if we have a few folks hopping in, please put your name, your gender pronouns if you'd like, and your organization in the chat, so we all know who's here. And feel free to use the chat as much as you'd like today. So before we get into the weeds of the training, we do want to start with a little question or two for y'all. So Allie will be popping in the chat a link to Menti, which if you all have been to trainings with us before, you know we love a good Menti. So we're going to ask two questions. It'll be the first two slides. The third one will be for the end. So don't go all the way to the end. So the first question is, have you done voter registration before? And the second question is, what do you want to get out of the training today? And you can put as many answers as you want in that second one. So you'll click the link in the chat. It'll open up a little page for you to type in this code. And the code is also in the chat and it's on the screen. And so once you put that code in, it'll ask you the first question and you can answer. And then you'll be able to answer the second question. If you have any issues, let us know. We're going to take just a couple minutes to do this section. All right, so we're getting some responses already. Awesome. Thanks, y'all. So far we have 88% of folks have done voter registration. That's awesome. This will be hopefully a really good refresher for you. And we'll be able to provide some maybe new information or information in a new way that maybe you haven't heard it before. And then 13% of y'all have not. So we're really excited that you're here to learn with all of us and get some knowledge. I'm gonna go to the next one and see what people have put here. If you haven't put this in yet, go ahead and fill it in. Fill in the first question. Okay, so second question, what do you want to get out of the training today? And we'll see responses pop up here as they come in. Hey, first response, yay, education to share. Best practices, beautiful. We will touch on these items. Feel free to get specific if you want. Yeah, so tools for getting the community engaged with the voter process, how SB1 impacts typical voter registration event, registration process, how to be effective in voter registration in the Black community. Love it. Best practices and how to keep track of voter registration efforts. Awesome. Yes, I love it. If there's anything else that you want to add in here, feel free to go ahead and put things in. We will have access to these responses and we can touch base on them after as well. I see some more things coming in. Yeah. Tools when someone is very resistant to voting. More about recruiting volunteers. I love that this column just keeps scrolling. So fun. Let's pause that. I'd like to learn more about recruiting volunteer voter registrars, tips on talking to hesitant potential voters, best practices in tracking data. Yes, we are going to talk about all of these things today. So I'm going to go back to our presentation and we're going to get started. I'm going to pass it over to Michael, who's gonna start digging into these best practices that y'all want to hear about.
Hey y'all, I'm excited to chat with y'all today. Also excited to see how many folks have done voter registration before. Hello to my fellow VDRs out there doing the work. Appreciate y'all taking time to be here today, and we're gonna talk through kind of the most important part of registering voters, which is surrounded around the conversation, but we're gonna cover some other tips as well leading up to getting to that conversation. I was really glad to see that folks lifted up like interacting with people that are maybe less enthused about the electoral process or, you know, are intentionally obstinate maybe in conversations. So we're going to practice some of that today, as well as just ways to make sure you stay organized and also how to build your network. A lot of the work that you do in voter registration overlaps with capacity building and can help your organizations grow in your respective space just by doing the work of registering voters generally. I want to start with the best way that we're going to talk about doing voter registration in Texas. So there are organizations and folks out there who maybe don't get deputized or are familiar with using the walkaway forms. The training today is going to be presented and centered around folks getting deputized. And that's the best way to help somebody register to vote when we talk about this getting into data. But really, once you're deputized, it's important to know where and how and when you're going to get deputized, which we're going to provide a link in the chat for Houston, Harris County for deputy classes. Excuse my dogs in the background. And then related to that, I think folks probably have some familiarity with reciprocity and what that means for folks that are getting deputized. Once you're deputized in Harris County, it's likely that you'll have surrounding counties, Fort Bend, et cetera, that will allow for reciprocity, although some will not. So you have to check in the counties you want to get deputized in to see if they accept reciprocity, because what that will do is stop you from having to take the test and the class in multiple places over time. So we wanted to lift that up. First things first, making sure that you work to get deputized in your community, working across counties and other areas you might be in, or if you think that you might be registering voters in a place with a lot of movers. I'm thinking about like universities, for example, folks that might be coming in for surrounding counties. And then making sure y'all get that reciprocity for where the work you do is. If I could get the next slide. Thank you. And just top lines to cover for making sure folks are eligible to register to vote. This list here is all the folks, all the limitations to getting registered and the things that folks need to qualify for. I do want to underline people that have been previously convicted of a felony. If they've completed fully completed their sentence, including probation and parole, the phrase that you can use with folks when you're talking to them about, which is really a sensitive topic, which is like people's past and history, if they're off paper, is the most common way to refer to that. If somebody says that they're off paper, they are eligible to vote. And just a reminder here, when you're out in the community, it's not our job to police eligibility. We want to make sure that we work with everybody in community to make sure they get the access they need to the systems they have. And we can talk about this in the Q&A if you have questions about some of the barriers here. If you do end up with an applicant who maybe falls short of one of these qualifications in order to register to vote later on. But if I could get the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about best practices. So if you're doing voter registration, you're very familiar with this concept here, that the difference between the required and optional fields on the voter registration form. The most important thing to highlight are 6, 7, and 8. So gender and phone number are both optional fields for the voter to, the applicant to fill out. And then under number 8, it is required to have either a driver's license or a social security number. You don't need both. And then also there's an option to check, I have not been issued a Texas driver's license, personal identification, or a social security number. And then in that option, as long as they filled out one of those 3, that is the only need you have to require its completion. And then just making sure it's signed and dated. So this is an example of those forms. But again, just to highlight, the optional fields here are gender and phone number. Everything else needs to be filled out. And you want to make sure as you're doing your work as a VDR that you ensure completion of all of your forms. So we wanted to lift this up as well. If I could get the next slide. So some things to make sure you walk into the field prepared as you go about registering voters. First, making sure you register every eligible voter. So this just means anybody that you engage with that asks to register, you have to allow them the opportunity to fill out the form. You don't let ideology or partisanship get in the way of what work we're doing on the ground. All voter registration efforts are nonpartisan. Another tip is to carry proof of your registrar status with you. So if you have a VDR certificate, getting a lanyard or maybe an envelope or a folder where you keep your VDR certificate with you is going to be really important when you're out in events. I like to keep my VDR certificate in a lanyard that's visible because it creates a little bit more of an official stance with folks. So there's a little bit more trust there that people know that I am deputized and am able to register them to vote in county. Another tip there, obviously make sure you review every form for completeness and accuracy. Voter registration, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but we refer to this voter registration programs as leaky funnels. And why is it a leaky funnel? It's a leaky funnel because folks' handwriting might not be as neat or as clean and the county might reject it. So we just wanted to underline making sure that you review that for completeness and accuracy, confirming that with the voter. And then stay organized. I like to use clear like clear like trifold envelopes or collapsible envelopes to keep all my voter registration applications in. You can use color-coded systems. I also like to put all of the due dates on sticky notes on top of my application so I remember when I need to get all of my forms back to the county, which takes me to our next line item here. Do make sure that you return these in person by 5 o'clock on the 5th day after collection or in coordination with any other law. The applicant receipt that you get for every voter that you register is really important, particularly when we address this like leaky funnel issue with handwriting and other things that might create an obstacle or a barrier for somebody to get registered to vote. The application receipt is available for the voter up to 30 days after, and it's their proof that they worked with you to get registered to vote. So you really want to emphasize making sure folks hang on to that. And then the last thing that we want to talk about, just underlining, making sure that all of your forms are handled only by people with the appropriate VDR certification. So what does that mean? That means if I'm in Houston and I have another person that is deputized in Fort Bend, but not in Harris County, I would not give them my Harris County forms. If they had got reciprocity from Harris County and I saw that they were also a VDR in Harris County, that means that I would be allowed to transfer my VDR, my voter registration applications to somebody that was also VDR'd in Harris County. In the event that maybe somebody was going to drop them off at the county already, right? So I've had friends that are saying, I'm gonna stop by your house to take your forms to the county registrar office, right? And I know that person's deputized, so I can give them my forms. The important thing here is making sure you don't use it, don't hand your forms to anybody that is not deputized. So if I could get the next slide. This is my favorite part. We're going to dig into the conversation now. So this is how we actually get folks registered. Working at the top, just making sure that as you're interacting with people that you are being warm and friendly. So working with people to make sure that you're open and greeting them, checking in, asking how their day is going so far. The other thing here that I wanted to underline, because it comes up as a pretty common obstacle in registering voters, is making sure you work with people to talk about making suggestions rather than statements. So when I'm out working with folks, I try to make sure that I say things like, let's make sure your voter registration is up to date. That tends to be more effective than a starter, are you registered to vote? Or do you want to register to vote, right? So by saying, let's make sure your voter registration is up to date is just one way to make sure that you're kind of like coordinating with the person as something to create intent so that they get ready to register. The other part there is making sure that when you're holding yourself in your clipboard, that it's not close to you, that you're giving that out, that it looks like you're handing it over right away. And the most important part here is don't give up easily. We'll talk about this with the 3 no's in a second, but working with folks, you know, I think everybody right now is just in kind of a heightened state. We have a lot going on in the world, and folks might be a little agitated or less willing to interact with folks that they might think is something that is partisan or political, right? So just being prepared not to give up easily when you're in community working with folks. If you see a group of students or maybe a couple out on a date, reminding or remembering to use peer pressure. So if a partner or members of the group are registered to vote and the other person isn't, working with their friends to kind of create that peer pressure in the moment can help make sure you get everybody registered. And then the last thing two things I want to talk about right here, the 3 no's. So some folks might feel a little hesitant to do this, but I guarantee you this works, particularly with people that maybe have hesitancy in getting registered to vote. Really the first no is, in the lead up to getting that first no, you're going to stress the importance of voting and making it personal. So making it clear that the upcoming election or moment is important and why it's important to you, why you would be happy if they participated in the election. Some people will register for no reason other than you really wanted them to. So that's an important thing to remember. If you get a no after that, the next chapter of this conversation is going to be sharing your personal story. So it's likely that there are moments in our lives where democracy and the systems that are in place have intervened negatively or positively through benefits or other systems. If you have a story related to how your vote impacted or changed your life directly, this is a good opportunity to open up and share that story. Because if you can connect the dots between your personal lived experience and the passion for why you're doing the work, it's another way to make sure that folks kind of understand the importance of what they're doing. After you get a third no, just smile, thank them for their time and move on. Don't take it too personally. Persistence does pay off, but if you draw the line at that 3 denial, it'll keep you and them having a good attitude and moving folks on with their day. And then the last thing here, which we'll talk about, I have an example of a pledge card on the next slide, but making sure you use pledge cards for follow-up information. And this comes up when we talk about engaging in elections, not cycle to cycle, but organizing year round. If you're able to get the information from that voter from the time you registered them and their contact information and maybe get them agree to sign up for updates or ways to get involved in their community in the future, that's a way for you to help grow your own organization outreach through that process. And so while it's important to make sure we get people registered to vote, it's also important that the train doesn't stop there, that we keep engaging them in other opportunities to participate in civic life. And this is the best way to make sure you do that when you're doing voter registration on the ground, is making sure you have a pledge card. And if we could go to the next slide. Oh, that's already up there. Okay, cool. So this is an example of a pledge card. It's pretty simple. You can see some of the information actually overlaps with information that we take from the voter registration application, which we'll talk about in a second. But key parts here are making sure you get the person's first name, last name, zip. Those 3 are the easiest ways for us to find that data to the registered voter for follow-up. Getting their phone number directly from them and their email address, as well as an opt-in, asking them to agree to just stay. The way that I would pitch this would be like, can we make sure we keep you up to date with everything that's going on? The law is changing and the election coming up. We want to make sure that you're able to cast your ballot okay, right? And so that might be something that you add to that person to get them to commit to do additional actions, right? So that's that on that. I'm going to pass it over to Layla to talk about some common scenarios and also hear from the audience about some of the things that they've experienced on the field as we get ready to go into our breakout. Layla, can I pass it over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just wanted to open it up to y'all actually on the floor. Everyone in the space, like for those who have done voter registration and have actually been there with the clipboard, talking to a voter, what are some common scenarios that you've encountered in voter registration? What are things that have popped up for you? And I'll pause and just give you all a second to think about that. And if you want to hop off mute and answer, you can, or you can put something in the chat and figure it out.
Layla, I think one of the most common things that I hear when it comes to registering people to vote is, why should I register to vote? My vote's not going to count anyway. That is a common thing that I come across.
Yeah, absolutely. I've encountered that too, for sure. Nikki's also had that. Language assistance. Yeah, Nikki, do you want to hop off mute and talk a little bit about that?
Okay, sure. Well, I've registered voters personally, and also in my role at MGH. And a lot of the events we go to, there are a lot of people from different countries, and someone might feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish or in Urdu, and I don't speak either of those languages, so it can be we have to find a translator. Also, want to echo what was just said. I also hear from people like, my vote doesn't count because of the Electoral College, and it's frustrating when you're trying to register people for a year that's not a presidential election, asking them to vote in local races, because that's doesn't have anything to do with the Electoral College.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Nikki. And Chris, I see you put in the chat, so much confusion about the language assistance now too, like who can help and who can't. Are there any other common scenarios that y'all have encountered? And if you have found a solution and you want to share that too, or how you handled that situation, we'd love to hear that.
I think Mark brought it up a bit, but about the peer pressure side, when somebody, I think people feel embarrassed in front of certain people if they aren't registered. And so it's almost like the peer pressure works if somebody will first admit that they are not registered.
Every time you find yourself here, because you chose to.
And is okay with it. I've just seen some situations where definitely like my vote doesn't count, like echoing what others have said, but also someone saying that, but then also not wanting to admit that they aren't registered. And so I think very much validating that, normalizing it, like it's okay. Like it literally will take 5 minutes, like just kind of meeting them there and not having any sort of like facial reaction or something to that, because I think they're like worried someone's going to judge them for maybe having never voted before. I've definitely encountered that too. And someone doesn't really want to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jordan. Tana, I see you put in the chat, giving personal stories sometimes helps to get them to register. Yes, absolutely. Back to what Michael shared. And the best practices, how you can connect that and say why you vote and why you care about democracy and civic engagement, and connecting why you're voting with an issue, especially if you're tabling or you're doing a voter registration activity in conjunction with an issue-based campaign, or if you're talking about, if you've been organizing around environmental justice or education or infrastructure or other issues that you're doing with your organization, and saying, well, this is what I care about. This is why I'm voting. This is why this election is so important for, the city council race or for the state legislature, and connecting those dots for folks. That's super important and can be very powerful. Jessie Mona, I see your hand is up. And if you're talking, you're on mute. Oh, I see that in chat, just getting to the polls. Yeah, like I have no way to get to the polls. I have no way to actually vote. And voting is, we know from SB1, like there are additional challenges right now for people voting and voting by mail. And so talking to people about, why it's important to register to vote, and then making sure that we connect people again with that pledge card, connecting with them again and sharing information about rides to the polls or other ways and information on how you can actually cast your ballot, how you can actually vote. Let's start with the first step. Let's get you registered. Let's start there. I see another comment here in the chat from Nikki. Among immigrant populations, I've also heard that they don't want to register because the government will have more of my information. And there's a fear factor to address without alarming people about how much information the government already has. True, the government already has a lot of this information about us. But also, like a lot of folks who are new Americans, right? They are eligible to vote, but come from countries and communities where voting is not the same, where the experience and interaction with government is very different. And so there's that element to keep in mind too. And I think that is really the fact that you brought this up. I think it's really it's a sign that, you know, depending on who is actually the person doing the voter registration makes a huge difference, and who is in the community doing the work. And so when you are from the community that you're registering voters in, that adds an element of understanding and cultural humility and awareness around what issues are important to the community, what struggles or barriers the community that you're in is dealing with, and how to address some of those concerns in a way that maybe someone else would not have the context or ability to address. And so that's also a really important factor. Juan or Michael, or other folks on the call, if you have, I know there's a couple things here that we've mentioned, so especially around language assistance, like what can people do, what can't they do? If anyone wants to hop in and share some clarifying information there, that would be really helpful.
I can speak to some things here, and actually not on this list is SB1, and I did see some comments on that. So let's just start with the list here, and then I'll mention some things about SB1. So starting with language and disability assistance, you as a VDR actually are able to also provide assistance to voters. So if there's a visual learning or language disability in filling that out, you just need to also include your signature on the form. And connect with your county VDR office or your voter registrar's office or your county tax office, wherever your voter registration center is, when you drop off the form, to let the office know this is a person that had a disability that I assisted. And what you'll do is allow the voter to sign or make a mark. If they're not able to make a mark, just literally a line or a mark from their hand and your signature below it, as well as making sure that the voter receives a receipt should address most of that. In-state IDs aren't required to get registered to vote. You will need one when you go to vote, but you do not need, there's a myriad of things you might use to replace that as well. But for an in-state ID and not having one, that's not going to stop you from registering to vote, as long as the person you're registering considers themselves and is a resident of Texas. So if they're living or going to the University of Houston, but are originally from Ohio, but plan to stay in Houston and vote in Houston, then they are a resident, they can register. Name change and gender follows with however the state sees you. So if on all of your legal documentation, the name that is reflected there, unfortunately, will also be the name that you register to vote with. You know that this is sensitive, particularly with folks in the trans community who end up being dead named. Not only in the process of registering to vote, but also going to vote in person themselves, that can be traumatic. However, if you are working with somebody that has questions about this, you really just want to work with them to say, what is your legal name with the government currently? And unfortunately, that is the way that you'll have to follow it. And it's just so that when they go to vote, they are able to cast their ballot. I wish we had more control or a way to change that, but that is the way that that's going to go in that scenario, is just working with the folks to say, how are you registered with the state currently? And that's going to have to be that. A reminder that the gender box is optional, right? So if you're having a conversation like that, it's important to lift that up. Folks don't need to fill that out, but their name does need to match their legal name. The other thing I want to talk on was SB1. SB1 did impact voter registration broadly, but not VDR's roles. So there's some good news in that. The good news is if you are not at the county, you are okay. The scarier part of that is that SB1 did change the structure of the relationship between the county and the state, as well as putting financial ties there together. So it's TBD this year to see how the state interacts and allows volunteer deputy registrars to do their duties in counties. But the counties are going to face most of the pressure there, in that they would be having to follow directions from the state. It is a cause for concern, but I haven't seen them disrupt too much yet. But just to talk to that, if you're a VDR, nothing has changed for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you everyone for sharing these scenarios. We know there's a lot of different things that can come up, and you know, it's something I do want to mention before we jump into the practice section of this training is, but like with practice, it gets a little bit easier, and it's going to something that I've realized in my own experiences doing voter registration is to kind of have a little bit of like a fearlessness about talking to people. You want to be very thoughtful and very intentional with how you address a myriad of issues, right? Because this is about someone's ability to vote. It's very important. But it's also okay if they reject you. You're like, no, I don't want to talk to you, because you go on to the next person, right? Like, it's okay to be like, okay, thanks so much, have a nice day. And when you encounter an issue, like that just means when I'm in that scenario that like someone is talking to me and engaging with me, and we have an opportunity to problem solve together. Even if I don't know all the answers in that moment, I can say, clearly you want to talk to me and you're sharing with me like this, we're encountering this, maybe this barrier together. And so that to me is an opportunity to solve it together and to figure out how can we get you registered? How can we make sure that you're able to vote if you're an eligible voter? And that experience will help you help another person when that comes up again. So I know it can feel very daunting because it's like, oh my gosh, there's all of these different scenarios that might occur, but it's all an opportunity to learn and make sure that more people are enfranchised to vote. So with that, I'm going to take us into the practice session. Yay! Part of the training, we're going to do a little debrief together. So debrief and reflection. So, we'd love to hear, how did it go? What worked? What could have been better? Any reflections? And I see Jessie has her hand up.
Yeah, Chana was a tough cookie. Surprised you guys put us together. We already worked together, right? Yeah. I accidentally hit the leave when I was telling her I'm homeless. I don't even know how you're going to get this pledge card to me. And she was saying that they have people that do outreach. And then when she did hers, she was telling me she works 7 days a week from 7 to 7. And there's no way that she's going to be able to vote. And she's 18, so she can't do mail-in ballot. And I said, well, I believe by law, I could check it out that your employer is supposed to allow you time at least to go vote. So why don't you give me your zip code where you work at, and I will look up a polling location that's in close proximity to where you live. So it worked out.
Awesome. Great job, y'all. That sounds amazing. Who else wants to share? Feel free to come off mute. Is that you offering?
Christina, our group, we had a good time in our group, but I saw you talking, Christine. I don't know if you forgot to come off mute.
No, I was talking to my office mate, because we have competing meetings right now. So.
Oh, okay, no problem. No problem.
But I can share my thoughts. So I was partnered with Jordan. We really just discussed. We didn't really go through the formal activity, but we discussed, because I'm new. I haven't really registered anybody to vote, so I'm still learning. And so Jordan gave me some things that she's ran into, and so we were just discussing the different points and how you would talk to people about it.
Does anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Michael and I had a good conversation. I did the scenario. I selected, because I work with those who are formerly incarcerated, meeting someone who was formerly incarcerated at an event. And he was telling me that, he has a felon. He didn't know, oh, I can't vote. I have a felon. So, I went into the mode of, asking him about, whether or not he's on paper or not. And, we discovered that he wasn't. So I was explaining to him that as long as he's not, then he can, exercise his right to vote, and explain why. Didn't have the picture ID with them, so I gave him the other form to make sure, he filled out and mailed. Did the contact card, asked him to fill it out right then and give it back to me, so I have his information to follow up with them. So we did that scenario, and then we kind of talked about why do I have to vote? It doesn't matter. And I talked about, not discounting what people's feelings are about voting, but just to explain to them why it's important to vote, while, your vote today may not be the deciding factor for what happens in the future, but it is one step closer to, what is wanted to be done or accomplished with, exercising your right to vote. So.
Michael?
Yeah, I think Diana also is underselling how good of a VDR she is. One of the additional things that she did that is not on our best practice list that should be, was like, as she was walking me through the process and why I should participate in the steps I needed to follow, she also like offered me her personal contact information. And like, as a person that was getting registered, in our dialogue, just that moment felt really personal. And I felt like that offer just immediately kind of established trust in that dialogue. And I thought that was great too, that sure, sign up for the organization, but also if you need anything, like I'm here to talk to you too. So that was just a really nice like layer on top of the outreach.
Oh, love it. Love to see it. Jordan?
Yeah, something else Christina and I talked about that connects with what Diana's saying is just talking about judicial elections and the importance of the judges who might come in contact with people that we love and or us. And I think that brings it to like, that's helpful on the my vote doesn't count, what I vote for doesn't matter, which is very valid feeling and validating people in that first. But then moving to, there are elections where it really does. And there, of course, as we all know, the ones where people turn out less too. So that was just something we discussed too.
Yeah, that's really, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's also something that we've been thinking about. I think a lot of folks are thinking about, how do we help? And maybe maybe there's more training or education that happens around how do we help people think about voting, not just as this thing that you do once, but as a part of everything that we do. And especially tying it in, not just like, oh, there's an election to vote, but like, what specifically are we voting on? Like, who are we voting for? And what does this role do? And how does it affect our lives? And like the issues that we care about. And so making sure we're making those connections, in addition to just learning the basics of how do we register to vote? Like, but why vote? What is it? Like, what happens when we go vote? What happens? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve when we go and vote? Yes, Tana, asking people what is important to them and engaging them in that conversation. That's so important. I want to make sure that we have enough time to go through the next part of our agenda, but please feel free to continue putting your reflections here in the chat. We'll save this chat. And this is really helpful information too for us as we think about future trainings like this. So I'm gonna share my screen again and pass it back over to Michael to walk us through tracking our voter registration efforts.
Awesome. Yep. So we're going to walk through some data terms here, I want to start by just talking about definitions. So I want to be really clear about these 3 words that I'm using, because these are different populations of folks that we at Houston Action and also just in the ether have some set of information on. So you're going to start with the word unregistered, right? And so what that is folks that we know that exist. We have some sort of data on them. It might be consumer data, but we know that they're there and that they're unregistered. The other population is applicant populations. So those are the folks that, like, if I have 140 forms, I have 144 applicants of people that I registered to vote. And then we need to make sure that they actually got onto the voter file and that there wasn't a barrier or an issue with their handwriting or any other issue. Maybe they didn't check off a box, who knows? So those are the different types of populations we're going to talk about. I'm going to focus mostly on applicant information today because I really want to like hone down this piece, because this is how we figure out if folks became registrants. So let's focus on applicants. You're going to hear me say the word applicant a million times now. But starting with structuring our data or information, you might have counts of these things at your org or across the work you're doing, like the number of pledge cards you collect. Better than that would be the number of pledges that you got and the number of confirmed registered voters you got. So maybe you have somebody in your camp that can actually check on the county file and say, we got this many folks pledged to vote and we were able to find this many people on the voter file. That's also great. But the best thing that we can get for folks is identifiable information to match so that we can find out everything we possibly need to about that person for continued engagement after the election's over, right? Because we want folks that we engage during the next several months to play a role over the next several years, fighting for the change that we know is not going to come in one election cycle, right? And so in order for us to do that, just a reminder, don't take the driver's license or the last 4 numbers of social security number or a phone number off the VR card, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But really getting first name, last name, zip, and date of birth is like the magical key that allows us to see so much more over time and actually gauge our efficacy and like building an electorate that looks more like Houston, that looks more like Texas. So if I could get the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about like the VR card that we've been talking about this whole time. I just wanted to translate that into like what that looks like once it gets over to the county. So this is an example of a voter, firsty lasty, and they were registered to vote. And you can see firsty lasty got registered to vote, and then that information from the voter registration card was added to a list of people at the county. So firsty lasty, who lives at 123 Main Street in Houston 78701, their gender and phone number, they didn't provide the gender and we don't have a phone number on them. That's because they didn't fill it out on the application card. And then once the county receives that set of data, we're able to find out all this other information from them from the county. So once they become a registered voter, there's also a history of whether or not they voted. And so what you can see here after the precinct column is 2020G, 2020P, and that's the general election or the primary election. And in that instance, I can see firsty lasty voted early in the primary in 2020 and early during the 2020 general election. And then the other thing here, the last time they voted, they didn't vote in 19, but they voted by mail in 2018 for the general election. And so this is just an example of some of the data that you'll see that application gets turned into this information that allows us to kind of build power in a more effective way when we have all of these other insights. So if I could get the next slide to talk a little bit more about that. The information you want to look at holding on to in order to gauge your efficacy long-term in organizing and bring these people back in, maybe into a volunteer pipeline, or maybe to come to a rally or testify, whatever additional asks or whatever additional capacity your organization might need, that voter that you registered might play a really integral role in your organization later on. And in order for us to make sure that that happens, we need from the voter registration applicant a certain set of information. So ideally, what you would hang on to from the application, from the county application, would be first name, last name, address, zip, and date of birth, and then also store or hang on to in an Excel file or any CRM of your choosing, if you have one at your organization. Separately, store first name, last name, zip, phone, email, opt-in. And if you save 2 of those 2 lists separately and hang onto your pledge cards, it gives us a lot of power to like help make data a two-way street in this conversation, like help you figure out how to target and build and grow your organization for any needs that you see fit. So this is a way that the data can play a supportive long-term role in organizing efforts. And if I could get the next slide. So this is just the why. I think I talked through some of these, but really just to be explicit about this, right? So why did we ask folks to, why are we saying this is a best practice? This is a best practice because it helps us identify folks, which we just talked about. It makes us, it helps us be able to see how many people actually got registered and if they went to vote and casted their ballot. The other thing this lets us see is insight into whether or not voters are being disenfranchised before they even get to the polls, right? So let's say there might be a county that was inhospitable in some way. Maybe you saw a lot of applicants get rejected, and that might actually be a time to explore like what's going on at this county that's preventing people from making it onto the voter file. The other thing that this allows us to see is the rate of applicants who were rejected for whatever reason. A lot of this time, there's nothing nefarious here. It's just bad handwriting, unchecked boxes, just incomplete forms. But if the event there was in collecting some of that information, you could do some follow-up there to folks that didn't get registered. We can also continue to engage these folks. Like I said, this is a great pipeline. This is a great way to get folks involved in the community. If you were the person that first introduced somebody into participating in like little d democracy and explain to them how these things matter, the likelihood that they're going to turn around and show up for you again, if you're able to build that trust in that moment, is really strong. We see this over time in organizing that folks that we meet, bringing them into a ladder of engagement could be pretty successful there. The other thing it allows us to do is follow up on why people didn't register, who were registered didn't vote. So what I would love to hear from folks is like folks that got registered by an organization who ended up determining for whatever reason or had some sort of barrier that prevented them from actually casting their ballot. What was that? Let's go find those folks and talk to them. Let's have a listening session. So those are all the things that this data allows us to do to like continue to help folks grow and expand and also learn. And so that's the why behind why we're saying these are some of the best practices here. If I could get the next slide.
Yes, and I just also want to add one other thing here too, is as we think about for folks here who are in our voter table, who are engaging in the 2022 election work as a part of the Houston in Action network, being able to capture this data and being able to dig into some of this is one other potential way that we can provide support to the network as Houston in Action, and think creatively around, well, what if we do want to do some listening sessions? What does that look like? And then us working with you all and coordinating on those efforts, so we can so organizations don't have to maybe do them by themselves in a silo, but we can really do that together and learn collectively around the strategies that we've employed together this year, and then learning from that as well. So I wanted to just plug that there.
Yeah, thank you for doing that too. Really want to underline that. It's so important.
So now Q&A. Questions, things that, I don't want to go, nope, not going that way, not over yet. I'm going to actually stop sharing so we can all see each other and also just talk through some of the things that Michael just shared, because I know that was a lot of information.
So Jesse Mona had a question about collecting. So just to get clarity on where we can collect voter information. So Michael, if you could go over that again, like what information can we pull from the voter registration card onto a spreadsheet or onto our database, and what information we need from a pledge card?
Yeah, thank you, Leila, for putting that back up. That was most exciting. So these are all items you can take from the voter registration tab on the left. So apologies for going through that maybe a little too quickly. First name, last name, address, zip, and date of birth. So things you can't take from that are things you wouldn't want to take. So last four of the social security number, a driver's license number. I have no interest in that. But the most important thing to make sure you don't take from a voter registration application is the phone number. You have to have the phone number separately on a different form that you got that information from. You can't take it from the VR form.
And so that's why the pledge card, and I also didn't like, this is, again, me and things I didn't know, and why I'm really glad we're talking about this is, you know, when I was in college and I was an intern with TFN doing voter registration, I was so annoyed by all the pledge cards. Because, you know, you're a volunteer, or maybe you're managing volunteers, right? And you have college students, they're the best volunteers, right? Who are doing a lot of this work out in the field. And they have to like, they're talking to a bunch of like tired people who've been working all day, or you're at an event and they're just like wanting to have fun and they don't want to come to your voter reg table, and then you get them there and they fill out the form and you're like, wait, you also fill out this other thing too. And so how do you get them to fill out that pledge card, right? Like getting them to pull out the pledge card is so important, because then you actually can get them to opt in to the organization's outreach, and you can take the phone number and you can call them up or you can email them, which you can't do with the VR form. And so that, I think, is really helpful. The voter registration application, lots of really great information there. That is very helpful in tracking data and looking at the voter file and sort of seeing the history of this voter, you know, figuring out if they voted, but it doesn't allow for the kind of follow-up that we would like to do, especially when we're doing very targeted voter registration efforts in our communities. And we're using a voter registration drive or an event additionally as like another way to engage in the community and get people involved, you know, in everything else that's going on in the neighborhood. So that's really the benefit of the pledge card, even though it is that added step. And it is, I think, really important for volunteers, especially volunteers that you're managing, to know why they're being asked and expected to get 2 documents completed by people. Tana, I see you have your hand up.
You know, Layla, one of the ways we use the pledge card is when we do events, virtual events and webinars and stuff, we also link the pledge form to our Bentley links or our Zoom links. And as people register for the event, the virtual events, we capture their information. If they say they will go out and vote. So that's one way we use our pledge card in events itself too, and out and about. But it's important, we find that it's important to ask family and friends, hey, y'all, fill this out. When we have events or anything like that, we have that information.
Thank you. I think we're having a glitchy situation with Dolores's mic. I did also see in the chat for Angela. So what verbiage would we use to get people to fill out that second card? I think that's a really great question. And I know, Tana, you just talked about this a little bit, but if you or anybody else has a real example that you'd like to share, please feel free to come off mute and share that. Or Michael, if you have a recommendation.
Okay, this is one way that I've done it in the past, is that if I'm filling out voter registration and some people say that they're already registered or something like that, I'll say, well, will you fill out my pledge form? So we can keep you, if anything comes up, we can tell you when the polls are, early voting starts, or, you know, information about where to go vote, you know, all of that. If you have a felony, all of that type of information. And sometimes that works.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Michael?
Yeah, I wanted to lift that up. That's a great point. The card does serve well so that you don't waste the conversation, right? So we want to register folks to vote, but if they are registered, you have another way to keep people engaged. And then I also saw a question here: can we write things on the pledge card for them while they're filling out their voter registration card? You could, but what I would suggest you doing is that you have to fill out the certificate, the receipt at the bottom. So what I like to do is while I'm filling out my side of the VR card, I hand them the pledge card, right? So I say, hey, I just got to fill out my half here and get you your receipt. Can you fill this out while I'm signing my side, right? And so that way you just kind of get some efficiency in there. They have to wait for you there anyway. So it's a great moment to spring that on them. The other thing too, for pledge cards, add anything on there that you want. If you want to put an issue box on there to check off, add that. Go crazy with it. The most important thing that we got off that though there is just first name, last name, zip to match, to add phone number and additional information later. This also works for matching folks to the voter file who said they were already registered and said that maybe they care about criminal justice reform or legalizing marijuana, whatever issue you pick, like that will allow you to find them on the voter file, and then you could even send them messaging about the stuff they care about or said they care about. So yeah, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on pledge cards for y'all.
Yeah, those are great ideas, Michael. Jesse, I see your hand is up. Jesse Mona.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We've gone through this before with PWN, and my understanding, I thought we had double checked this with the elections people downtown. We're not supposed to take anything off of that voter registration application. Nothing. Not supposed to take a picture of it, not supposed to take anything off the voter registration card. The pledge card is something totally different. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse Mona. Michael.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that. Several attorneys have worked to develop ways in which you can collect the information from the application. So the information that's located on the left hand of this slide is able to be taken from the voter registration card. However, the point of that was true to underline and emphasize, you cannot photograph a card. You can't take a picture of a card and then say, I'm going to enter this into a spreadsheet later. You need to manually enter the information that you have from the VR card, and that is allowed. But yeah, no photographs, no copies. That's not legal. And a great point.
I called the Secretary of State and I called Elections downtown, and they both said the same thing. I didn't get the name, but I can get the name and get that to you later because we've gone through this.
Yeah, I would also be happy to get y'all in touch with election attorneys because the truth is that you are able to do this. It is legal and it has been used by many organizations over the last 7 to 8 years to help match this. This is a common practice nationally and also in coordination with groups like Everybody Votes. But yeah, it's very common. It is allowed. It is legal. I think getting election laws resources on help on that. And then a thing to flag is that the Secretary of State's office is not particularly helpful. It's not interested in enfranchising people to vote. So it's likely that they're going to tell you things that while might be their recommendations are in fact not necessarily directly aligned with the law and like what you can actually do with that information. So just underlining that too for folks that the county's great, but the SOS might make suggestions that could prohibit you from doing VR, but I would defer to an attorney on all of this for additional support for sure.
Yeah, I think maybe them saying you can't take this off versus it's illegal to do this. I also wanted to lift up something that I've also seen with voter registration pledge cards is that I think is neat, but it does, I think it's a more of like what's within your budget around doing pledge cards. And this might be something that's for another conversation around like creating your pledge cards. Like I think that could be a really fun workshop that we could do together on how to create one that's really like aligned with what you're making and what you're doing in the community that will help you get the information you need from folks. But I've also seen organizations make a pledge card that's like a postcard really. And so it's like people are filling something out.
I was waiting for.
People are filling out this little postcard size pledge card, right? They put their information in and they give it to you and you can enter it. But really the idea is that it's a postcard that's then sent back to them. And on one side, it has their information that they just filled out and the other, it's a reminder to vote. So when they register to vote and they fill out the pledge card and they give it to you, so you can mail it back to them. And it's like they're mailing themselves, their future selves, hey, remember to go vote. Remember you filled this out, and it shows them, hey, yeah, I did. It's like a future postcard to yourself to vote. So I thought that was a really neat pledge card that I've seen, and can be one way to get people to fill out that document, because it's sort of like a little kitschy thing, like, hey, can I get you to fill out this postcard to yourself for next month? We'll send it back to you as your reminder, rather than just getting a random reminder in the mail. And that also allows you to capture their info. Are there any other questions or items that you'd like us to clarify? Because I'm really glad that we went back to this slide and talked about it. And I'm glad that we also mentioned, that Jesse Mona brought up, like, you cannot photograph a voter registration form. You cannot take off the social security number, last 4 digits, right? You can't take off the phone number. You can't take the driver's license number. Just the items here on this left side of the screen. And that's why the pledge card is really helpful, to get the additional information with consent from the person you're interacting with. Is there anything else that we can clarify for y'all here in this space? If not, we'll move on.
I just wanted to see if the other presenter can put the information in the chat for the attorney that he spoke with that said that we can get this stuff off of these voter registration cards. Thank you.
Of course. So there's 3 attorneys that I'm familiar with or have worked with. The first is Brady and Peavy. That's a law firm based in Texas.
Can you
The
put
second,
it in the chat and I can copy it down, please?
yeah,
If you have their number, that'd be great. Thank you. Or email.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll share this with you. And so as we go into the, to wrap up, I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. As we, move forward now, I want to look up a couple of things. So one is we will be sharing with everybody who attended the recording, the slides from today, so you can have them to reference back to. But we'll also be sharing a one-pager on the best practices that you can use for yourself, that you can use for your volunteers in the future, that you can have on hand. We will also provide a template spreadsheet for tracking the voter registration efforts on your end, so that you can decide, how you want to move forward in terms of the amount of information you'd like to collect. And this, of course, will not be the last time that we have this conversation. And there are other partners that we work with who will also be doing some similar trainings.